At the end of the 19th century, Spain was a nation that walked among ghosts and shadows of a past that no longer belonged to it. That legendary empire, the same one that under the command of Carlos I and the iron fist of Felipe II had drawn with blood and gold the maps of the known world, was now crumbling into tragic and absolute silence. There was no longer a trace of the tercios that made the soil of Europe tremble with their mere presence, nor of the galleons loaded with silver that crossed the oceans defying the elements. What remained was a worm-eaten structure, a building majestic in appearance, but rotten at its foundation, supported only by wounded pride and by columns that threatened to collapse at the first breath of wind. The greatness was still there, but it was trapped. He lived in the gloom of the museums, in the bronze statues that time had turned green, and in the portraits of forgotten kings who looked from the past with eyes of deep reproach. But if you looked down at the reality of the street, if you moved away from Velázquez's paintings, the truth was heartbreaking. In 1895, Spain was a nation aged before its time. An exhausted nation, bled by decades of fratricidal civil wars and deeply divided by political hatred that no one knew how to explain anymore, but that everyone was willing to defend with rifle in hand. The country survived under the Bourbon Restoration system, a political structure that was, in reality, a big lie organized under a veil of elegance. There was talk of democracy in the cafes of Madrid, but in the provinces the most blatant fraud was practiced. There was talk of public order and peace, but that peace rested on the most cruel and suffocating despotism. A small group of privileged people, an elite that lived in a bubble of glass and silk, shared power, money and influence in casinos and aristocratic salons, while the rest of Spain sank into the mud of ignorance and oblivion. In the capital, the carriages shone under the light of the new streetlights and the gala dinners seemed to have no end. There was an artificial peace, a tranquility bought with deception and office pacts. But just a few kilometers from those palaces, the real Spain, the Spain that sweated and suffered, screamed in pain in a silence that no one wanted to hear. Millions of peasants in the south, of workers in the factories of the north and entire families in Castile, survived in the most absolute misery, the illiteracy that chained their minds and the total lack of a decent future. The gap between official Spain, that of the ministers and empty speeches, and the real Spain of the thirsty fields, was not a simple crack, it was a dark abyss that no one dared to cross for fear of what they would find on the other side. While the outside world ran at dizzying speed towards the future, Spain seemed to walk backwards, always looking towards a yesterday that would not return. Great industrial powers like England, mighty Germany or the emerging and ambitious United States, were forging a new era of steel and steam. They built gigantic factories that darkened the sky with the smoke of progress, they launched armored battleships that defied storms and enemy fleets, and they wove railway networks that connected the most remote corners of the planet. But our nation remained in chains. Chained to old tariffs that protected a few, to public debts that ate up the national budget before it reached the people, and to almost feudal structures that suffocated any attempt to modernize the spirit of the country. And just when the nation was at its most fragile point, the overseas horizon began to turn blood red. Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the distant Philippines. The last jewels of a crown that no longer had shine, but that refused to let go of its treasures. The last remains of that ancient empire where one day the sun did not set, began to burn simultaneously as if destiny had agreed to collect all the debts together. They were not simple local revolts of discontented peasants. In 1895, the Cuban insurrection broke out with a fury, a mystique and an organization that the government in Madrid, in its colonial arrogance and its political blindness, was not able to understand until it was too late. The reports from the spies reached the minister's office's warning of the imminent danger, of the gunpowder that was accumulating in the jungles, but the responses were slow, clumsy and loaded with an aristocratic arrogance that would cost the lives of thousands of young Spanish soldiers. On the other side of the Atlantic, a young, strong and hungry predator watched our every move with terrifying calm. The United States, the new industrial giant of the American continent, did not view the conflict with humanitarian concern, it viewed it with implacable strategic greed. They were sitting at the table of destiny, waiting for the exact moment, the ultimate diplomatic blunder, to pounce on the wounded prey and claim their piece of the world. They were the engineers of a new world order who knew perfectly well that the time of the old Spain was over, and they were more than willing to give it the final push towards the precipice of history. The atmosphere in the Spanish ports was electric, heavy, charged with a tension that could be cut with a knife in every sailor's tavern and every infantry barracks. The entire world held its breath, because it knew it was about to witness an event that would change textbooks forever. The coup de grace, the final humiliation that would put an end, once and for all and forever, to 4 long centuries of Spanish rule on the face of the earth. Spain was not simply facing a rebellion of discontented peasants on a distant island, it was facing the agonizing and bloody end of an era that would never return. At dawn in 1895, the deep echo of the Grito de Bear broke the heavy and humid silence in the jungles of Cuba. But this was no ordinary revolt, it was not the disorderly uprising of previous decades that Madrid could quell with empty promises. It was a modern war of independence, a fight planned with almost surgical precision and fueled by the pen, the mystique and sacred fire of José Martí. Martí was not just a political leader, he was a prophet of freedom who had achieved the impossible, uniting the old generals of past wars with a youth hungry for sovereignty and dignity. Although fate wanted him to fall soon in the Battle of Dos Rios, his death was not the end of the insurgency, but the birth of an invincible martyr. His figure became a shadow that ran through every corner of the bush, a spirit that fueled the courage of the Mombases as they hid among the thick vegetation, waiting for the exact moment to launch their machete charge against the tired Spanish troops. Madrid's response to this fire that threatened to devour everything was desperate, clumsy and ultimately brutal. They sent General Valeriano Weyler, a man of iron and unbreakable will who firmly believed that war could only be won with the total extermination of the enemy's will. Weyler quickly understood that the rebels were nothing without the logistical and moral support of the people, and decided to apply his darkest and most controversial policy, reconcentration. It was a ruthless decree that condemned hundreds of thousands of innocent peasants, old people who could barely walk, desperate women and small children, to leave their homes, their animals and their crops to be locked up in cities surrounded by barbed wire and deep ditches. The strategic objective was clear: empty the countryside to leave the rebels without food, without shelter and without information. But the human result was a true hell on earth that would stain the image of Spain forever. Within those concentration camps, death became the only constant and safe companion. Hunger devoured bodies to the bone, typhus and smallpox spread like a biblical plague in overcrowded, inhumane conditions, and the mortality rate reached such atrocious levels that it shocked the conscience of the entire world. Those images of starving children looking at the camera with empty eyes and men turned into living skeletons did not remain isolated on the island. They crossed the ocean hand in hand with daring journalists and became the perfect fuel for the international press machine. The great newspapers of the time, especially in a United States that was already sharpening its claws, portrayed Spain not as a civilized nation in Europe, but as a medieval executioner, a bloodthirsty, soulless monster that fed on the suffering of the innocent. World public opinion began to boil with carefully fueled indignation, shouting for someone to stop the carnage that Spain was committing in its blind desperation to not let go of its last and most precious colonial jewel. But while fire and disease consumed the Caribbean, half a world away, in the humid, stifling and treacherous jungles of the Philippine Islands, another fuse had been lit with the same intensity. There, in the darkness of secret lodges and clandestine candlelit meetings, the Katipunan Society conspired to deliver the final blow to Spanish rule in the Pacific. Spain, a nation with a completely empty public treasury, with a devalued currency and an economy mortally wounded by corruption, was forced to fight 2 brutal wars, costly and simultaneous in two opposite hemispheres of the planet. It was a logistical nightmare that no power of the day could have endured for long. With an infinite ocean of distance in between, Madrid had to send thousands of young soldiers recruited by force, many of them just children who had never left their villages and who did not even know how to locate Cuba on a map, to die in foreign lands for a flag that no longer fed them. Many did not even get to see the face of the enemy. They died before disembarking from tropical fevers, from the unbearable heat that melted their wool, and from a total and criminal lack of basic medical supplies. The Spanish state did not have the money to pay for the coal that powered its ships, nor the stale bread for its soldiers, nor the minimum medicines for its thousands of wounded who were rotting in improvised hospitals. Spain was exhausted, empty of resources and morale, fighting against time, against geography, and against a history that devoured it day after day. The empire was bleeding from all its open arteries, and what no one in Madrid wanted to accept yet is that the true enemy, the most powerful and lethal, had not yet shown its true cards in this deadly game for world domination. To the north of the suffering and bleeding Cuba, a young, vibrant and massively industrialized power looked at the waters of the Caribbean with the cold eyes of an owner who claims what he believes to be his by right of force. The United States did not see the island of Cuba as a simple colony in trouble. It did not feel pity for the peasants who died in the cities of Whaler. What they saw in Washington was a gigantic sugar business, a strategic military position that was the master key to control the future Panama Canal and, above all, the backyard necessary for its expansion as a global empire. They didn't need a real moral reason, but they knew that to lead a people to war, you must first poison their soul. And that's what they were for. The architects of hate. In the New York newsrooms, men like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer ran a war machine made of ink and lies. Hearst had said it clearly, you put up the photos, and I'll put up the war. In their offices, the truth had no value. What mattered was selling millions of copies and lighting a fire in the hearts of American citizens that nothing could put out. They invented rapes of American women by Spanish officers, they invented massacres that never occurred, and they portrayed the Spanish soldier as a bloodthirsty animal, an inferior being who must be annihilated in the name of civilization. The stage was set for the great tragedy, and fate, or perhaps a black hand, delivered the perfect excuse in the darkness of a hot February night. On February 15, 1898, the port of Havana seemed to be calm. But at 9:40 at night, the world changed forever. The American battleship USS Maine jumped into the air in an infernal explosion that illuminated the Cuban sky as if it were broad daylight. The roar was so brutal that it was heard throughout the city, as the ship's steel twisted like paper under the heat of the fire. 266 American sailors died at that instant. Some were disintegrated by the explosion, others drowned trapped in the compartments of the ship that was rapidly sinking in the mud of the port. His cries of agony were the beginning of the countdown for Spain. In Madrid, panic took over the ministries. The Spanish government, aware that a war against the American giant would be collective suicide, a senseless massacre, immediately offered a joint investigation. They swore before God, before the press and before the embassies throughout Europe that Spain had nothing to do with the explosion. They offered to disarm the mines, they opened their files, they begged for a chance to prove their innocence. But no one cared about the truth. The sentence had already been written in the headlines in New York long before the smoke from the Maine had cleared. The war cry swept through the streets of America like a plague, remember Maine. To hell with Spain. It was a scream that brooked no dialogue, a scream that only asked for blood and fire. President McKinley's ultimatum arrived in Madrid with the coldness of an executioner. It wasn't a diplomatic proposal, it was a public humiliation. The United States, with infinite pride, offered to buy the island of Cuba. He offered money, dollars stained with ambition, in exchange for Spain to surrender its honor, lower its flag and leave through the back door of history, in silence and with its head down. But in Madrid, in a court that was still living in the 16th century, pride was stronger than the most basic logic. Spanish politicians, trapped in their own myths of conquest, in the memory of the tercios of Flanders and in an idea of honor that no longer had a place in a world of steel battleships, responded with a phrase that sealed the fate of thousands of young people: "The honor of Spain is priceless." It was an act of heroic romanticism that seems crazy to us today. It was an unforgivable diplomatic suicide. Spain, with a fleet of old wooden and iron ships that could barely sail, with an army of starving recruits who were dying of dysentery in the jungles, and without a single ally on the entire European continent, had just declared war on the first industrial power on the planet. While in the Spanish ports mothers cried goodbye to their children who were marching to certain death, in Washington the generals were already toasting with champagne. They weren't preparing for an equal war, they were preparing for a technical execution. The steel giant was about to crush the clay giant, and the tragedy that was to come would leave a scar on the soul of Spain that would not heal for 100 years. The die was cast, and the sacrifice of an entire generation of Spaniards was about to begin under the cannons of a nation that knew no mercy. The war was not decided in the mud trenches, nor in the dense, suffocating jungles of the jungle. It was decided in the deep, dark waters of the ocean, and it was a technical carnage that the world will never forget. In the distant bay of Cavite, in the Philippine Islands, the tragedy began with a dawn that brought the smell of death. Admiral Montojo's squadron was a group of tired ships, ghosts of another era with wooden or old iron hulls that could barely stay afloat. When Admiral Dewey's American fleet appeared on the horizon, there was no battle, there was cold, systematic execution. Modern American steel cannons fired from a distance that the old Spanish cannons could not even reach. One by one, the Spanish ships were torn apart by projectiles that passed through iron as if it were paper. The sound of metal twisting under enemy fire was deafening, a cry of steel that mixed with the screams of the sailors. The Spanish, engulfed in flames and surrounded by boiling water from the explosions, refused to surrender. They fought with desperate rage until their ships became iron tombs, slowly sinking into the mud of the bay. In a few hours, the Spanish presence in the Pacific had been annihilated, leaving behind a trail of black smoke and the silence of absolute defeat. But the deepest drama, the one that would break the heart of the nation, was about to occur in the waters of the Caribbean, off the mouth of the Bay of Santiago de Cuba. There, Admiral Pascual Cervera, a man who personified the honor of the old Navy, received the most bitter order of his entire life: he had to take his fleet to the open sea. It was a suicidal order, dictated from the comfortable offices of Madrid by politicians who preferred to see their ships sunk with honor than surrendered by pure logic. Cervera knew perfectly well what awaited him outside. A wall of American battleships, giants of armored steel, fast, modern and armed with devastating firepower that surpassed their ships in every way. He knew he was sending his men, those young sailors who were just beginning to live and who trusted him, to a certain death, cruel and senseless. That July morning, the sun burned on the deck. Admiral Cervera dressed in his dress uniform. He adjusted his buttons and looked at his officers for the last time with infinite sadness in his eyes. He made the decision that his ship, the Infanta Maria Teresa, would leave first. He wanted to be the first target. He wanted to receive the first impact so that his men would know that their leader was not abandoning them in that hell of fire. When the first Spanish ship crossed the bay exit, the entire horizon burst into flames. The American fleet showed no mercy. It wasn't a fight between equals, it was a duck hunt on a monumental scale. The Spanish ships, surpassed in speed, tried to flee close to the coast while they were relentlessly bombarded by projectiles that disintegrated everything they touched. The wooden decks became floating bonfires that were impossible to put out. Sailors were burned to death next to their artillery pieces, firing until the metal was red hot, defending a flag that could no longer protect them. The Vizcaya, the Admiral Oquendo, the Christopher Columbus, were pursued like wounded prey and riddled with bullets until their captains, in a last act of mercy for their crews, decided to run them aground against the rocks to save the few men who were still breathing. While the Spanish ships burned on the shore, projecting a column of smoke that could be seen from miles away. Admiral Cervera was rescued from the water, half-naked, wounded in the soul and defeated, by the same American sailors who had just destroyed his world. That day, between the black smoke that covered the Cuban coast and the cries of the wounded lying on the sand, not only a squad of brave men died. That day the transoceanic empire that once astonished the planet died definitively. The last echoes of the ships of Charles I and Philip II sank beneath the waves, devoured by the steel of a new power that did not understand romanticism or ancient honors. The history of Spain had changed forever in a single morning of fire, blood and political shame. It was the end of a dream of 400 years, extinguished by the noise of modern cannons. As the empire crumbled amid the whispers of Paris dispatches and the smoke of naval battles, in a remote, forgotten and suffocating corner of the island of Luzon, time seemed to stop completely. In the small church of the town of Baler, a stone structure surrounded by the immensity of the Philippine jungle, 50 Spanish soldiers barricaded themselves with a determination that defied all human logic. Those men refused to accept the unthinkable. For them, the red and yellow flag continued to fly proudly over a territory that Spain, in the distance of Europe, had already formally ceded. What began as a military defense became a survival odyssey that would last 337 days. Almost an entire year of absolute isolation, of silence and a resistance that bordered on the deepest madness. Surrounded by thousands of Filipino revolutionaries who did not understand why that handful of men continued fighting, the Spanish soldiers faced enemies much more lethal and invisible than lead bullets. Beriberi, dysentery and the most atrocious hunger became the true attackers of the church. The bodies were wasting away, the skin was sticking to the bones and the minds were beginning to weaken under the weight of a heat that gave no respite. They ate rats that hunted among the rubble, reptiles that sneaked through the cracks and bitter leaves to trick a stomach that no longer remembered the taste of bread. Every night was a battle against despair, and every morning a miracle of will. The Filipino besiegers, in a gesture of strange humanity, threw them fresh newspapers brought from Madrid to show them that the war had ended months ago. They shouted at them that Spain had surrendered, that there was no longer an empire to defend, that their families were waiting for them at home. But the Spanish detachment, led by unwavering pride and a distrust born of isolation, believed that it was all a ruse, a brilliant lie from the enemy to make them lower their guard and surrender the square. They lived in a time bubble where Spain was still a world power. They were unaware that their country had been humiliated, that their ships were at the bottom of the sea and that they no longer owned anything in that hemisphere. Only when Lieutenant Martin Cerezo, with his eyes clouded by fatigue and illness, read a trivial and personal news story about the fate of a comrade in a Spanish newspaper that could not be false, the blindfold of denial finally fell from his eyes. Reality hit them harder than any cannon shot. They were no longer heroes defending a border, they were castaways from a history that had left them behind. When the doors of Baler's church finally opened, no defeated soldiers came out. Specters emerged, walking shadows of an ancient honor that no longer had a place in the new century. The Filipinos, who had been trying to kill them for almost a year, were left speechless with astonishment. Moved by a resistance as absurd as it was heroic, they were not arrested, they were not humiliated. They let them go with war honors, calling them friends and giving them food. It was the last act of an army that, technically, no longer had a country to defend. The last of the Philippines closed, with their blood, their stubbornness and their sacrifice, the final chapter of 4 centuries of Spanish presence in the Pacific. An epic ending to an empire that refused to die, even when there was nothing left to fight for. On December 10, 1898, in the coldness of the Paris offices. Spain signed its death certificate as an imperial power. It was a surreal and painful scene. For barely $20 million, a figure that was a bloody insult after 4 centuries of history, of blood spilled and civilization built, the country suddenly handed over Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippine Islands and Guam. A year later, in a final and desperate gesture of technical and moral bankruptcy, Spain sold the Caroline Islands, the Marianas and Palau to the German Empire. The inventory of the empire was finished. The maps had to be redrawn, and the empire where the sun never set, the one that had dominated the destinies of humanity since the time of the Catholic monarchs, was finally left in darkness. But the real disaster, the wound that would take generations to heal, was neither territorial nor economic. It was a moral disaster that penetrated to the bones of every citizen. The return of the surviving soldiers was the slap of reality that woke the nation from its long dream of greatness. The Spanish ports were filled with wounded men, starving, dressed in rags and abandoned to their fate by the same state that had sent them to the slaughterhouse. Those walking specters were the mirror where Spain was forced to look at itself, and what it saw was an aging nation, sick with pride and empty of future. In the midst of this emptiness, of this bitter silence of defeat, the desperate cry of the generation of '98 arose. Intellectuals, poets and philosophers like Miguel de Unamuno, Antonio Machado, Pío Baroja and Valle-Inclán did not look for culprits in Washington or London. They sought the causes of the disaster in the very bowels of a Spain that had refused to modernize, that had clung to the glories of the past while the present slipped through its fingers. Spain hurts me. Unamuno wrote with a broken soul, summarizing in 3 words the feelings of an entire people who felt orphaned of their own history. The nation had lost its last overseas jewels, but in that pain, in that cure of humility forced by American canons, a new Spain would be born. A Spain forced to stop looking at the maps of the conquerors to start looking at the reality of its fields and its schools. The 19th century ended for us like a Greek tragedy, among the smoke of gunpowder, the crying of mothers and the loss of a world that will never return. It was the end of a dream of 400 years, a brutal lesson about the arrogance of empires and the fragility of honor when there is no bread or steel to sustain it. I'm MentorNoriegaIA, and today we witness the collapse of the last giant. The story continues, but the empire that one day changed the world, is gone forever in the tides of '98.